Hey, it's James here, and I made you a quick training on how to tell a better story. Listen, as a leader, one of your primary jobs is to be a great communicator. And when you're talking about communication, there's no better way than storytelling. And so I want to walk you through a couple of really quick, easy tips that you can put into practice right away to make your stories better, okay? But first of all, why stories? I mean, aren't we at work? Like, why would we be telling stories at work? This isn't summer camp. Well, listen, stories, in fact, a story is a vehicle of transmission. And I'm not going to go in this video all into the background of the brain and how it works and how it really is pre-wired to understand story more than anything else. But a story is a vehicle of transmission. Think of it like a Trojan horse. That your story is the Trojan horse, but the point that you're making is like the little guys inside the Trojan horse, which end up being responsible to get behind the walls of the city. And as a leader, your goal is to be effective in delivering messages. And if you're not telling stories, you're leaving a huge chunk of your potential as a communicator off the table. So let's go ahead, though, and walk through stories, and I'm going to take you through the story arc. Now, all great stories, well, at least most great stories, are going to follow this type of formula, whether it's a 2-hour movie or even a 3-minute story. There's going to be a setting, and the setting is the very beginning of the story, and it usually just has a character and a place. It's all we need. We don't need the backstory. We don't need a long backstory. We just need setting and place. Our brain needs to create some context so we have an initial picture to start with. Then what makes a story is something that happens. It's also called the inciting incident. And when the inciting incident happens, think of this as when someone's telling the story and then they use the words, and then this happened, right? Or suddenly, that's usually the inciting incident. And when the inciting incident happens, now there's a new goal that's put into place that wasn't there before. But what makes a story even more powerful is that there is going to be a problem. So on the way to this new goal, there's some kind of struggle, there's some kind of rising stakes. All of this creates tension, which we'll get to in a moment, why that's so important. And ultimately, there's some kind of peak, some kind of climax. Are we going to win or lose? Are we going to get the contract or not? And after the climax, there's some kind of resolution where the tension is finally resolved, the character is evolved, and there's a moral or a lesson. In other words, every story should have a moral or a lesson to it, or a point to it. And that's your Trojan horse. In other words, what's the point of the story? Okay? So just following this framework alone, you can make your stories better. Now, people communicate in stories all the time. When you go on the weekend to meet your friend at Starbucks and you guys are talking about your week, just notice it's just stories. It's just an exchange of stories. Well, you'll never believe what happened to me at work this week. So I came into the lunchroom and then and someone starts telling a story. That's how it works. But let's talk about how we make a story better, because that's what this video is about. So I want to introduce you to this, tension, the magical power that keeps your audience engaged. So tension is what happens in a story when the character wants to get something, and maybe it's you, the character you're telling the story, you want to get something, but there's obstacles in the way. So remember back to our story arc, there's some kind of inciting incident, that's that little spark right there, and that kicks off a time of tension. Well, what tension does, tension creates attention or draws attention. That's how you keep people riveted to your story, where there has to be tension in it, because they want to know what happens next. But the longer you sustain attention, the more people's emotions are actually drawn into the story, and they begin to share the emotions of the storyteller, when that might be you if you're the main person in the story. And the longer they share emotions with the main character, the greater the chances that they're going to mimic the feelings and behaviors when the story is over. Now, again, I'm not going into all the implications of this, but it's a really powerful concept. In fact, the brain gets involved on so many levels when we're telling a story. Oxytocin gets released. Oxytocin release leads to an increase in trust for the storyteller, and as a leader, you want to build trust, and stories is one of the ways to do it. Dopamine gets released when you begin telling a story because everyone's brains are like, ooh, a story, it's interesting. Cortisol gets released when you are telling a story that has tension in it. And so you actually put people into a little bit of a stress mode, but that's what draws them in and makes them pay attention. And that extra emotion, think of like the emotion like a molecule, and it binds to the point that you're making at the end so that people will remember it better. Okay? So that's the idea, is to make sure that there is tension in a story and people are going to pay attention more. Now, let me talk quickly about the biggest mistakes that storytellers make, okay? So we've all listened to somebody telling a story, and maybe they go on and on and on and they lose us. So they're not telling a story in a good way. So let's talk about some of the biggest mistakes. Number one, too much time on the backstory or setting. Maybe you've got that uncle, and at family reunions, he wants to tell a story, but first he's got to set the scene, and it's 30 minutes of that, and he loses everyone. We think people need more of the backstory than they do. Try to make your stories, when it talks about the setting, that original place, just who is it and where are they or what are they doing. People don't need much more than that. So too much time spent on the backstory is a mistake people make. Number two, an inciting incident not clear enough. So when I work with people in a storytelling workshop, this is one thing that we work on, making sure that there is a really defined and then this happened moment, which is going to kick off a new set of goals. And that's going to lead to mistake number three, where tension is not developed because there are no stakes. Now, when you're telling a story, there's often stakes, but sometimes we just don't communicate them well. And I'll give you an example of that when I do kind of a story makeover in real time here. And then number four, the other biggest mistake storytellers make is that there's no point. Have you ever had this happen? Someone starts telling you a story, and like after 10 minutes, you're starting to wonder, like, where's this going? Like there's no, and then they just stop and you're like, wait, what? Is there more? No, there's not more. And you realize that was just a waste of 10 minutes of my life because there was no point to it, right? So biggest mistakes storytellers make are those four things right there. So let me give you an example of, I was just actually doing a workshop, and what I have people do in the workshop is I have them all think about a story from their own personal life and kind of run it through the story arc and come up with a point at the end. And so this woman, she had this fantastic story, and she was maybe in her 60s, and she talked about how one time her family, they were living in Europe, and they were going to go on their vacation, like summer vacation, and they all crammed into this little Fiat, four of them, and they were driving up through the mountains, and their car broke down. And it was outside this little village, and what happened was the fan belt broke. And they went in this village, and there was no place to stay. There was no places to fix the fan belt either. And so what happened was the husband ended up asking the wife if she had any pantyhose, and she did, and he used the pantyhose to create a new belt, and he actually fixed the car, and they kept driving. So it was a really cool story. But let's go back. Let's take a look at kind of the guts of this story, right? So family is leaving for a vacation in a small Fiat. The car breaks down in a tiny village. Husband fixes the car with wife's pantyhose. That's kind of the data of the story. But what can we do with this? So let me show you how we can build this out. So let's go ahead and bring back our story framework. So we've got our setting, right? The family's leaving for vacation, this small Fiat. We don't need to tell a big backstory there. But then we're going to talk about, and then this happened. The car breaks down in this tiny village. And if you're telling the story, you're going to be describing that part, right? So we're driving along, and all of a sudden we hear this noise, knock, 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 knock. And suddenly the car stops. So you're going to describe that, and then. And so again, this is our inciting incident, but here's the thing. What does this mean? And so you have to tell people, like, basically, our car breaks down, we're in the middle of nowhere, and we've got our kids with us in the car, and now we start adding in some tension. Right? We could talk about how it's getting darker. We can talk about how there's no place to sleep in this town. We can talk about how the car is too small to sleep in, or how cold it might be in the night. So we can start describing this stuff, trying to figure out what to do. Then we can add even more tension. Once the husband decides to try this crazy idea of using his wife's pantyhose to fix the car, he he's going to try it, but will it work? And so there's all this tension there because, hey, so he ties this knot, and then he gets back in the car and he puts the key in, and then he looks at me and says, if this doesn't work, we're in trouble. So we're building tension as we're telling the story. And he turns the car over and it starts running. And so then that is where we realize, hey, it works, and we're off to the races, and that's the story. And then, well, what's the point of the story? Well, the point of the story, we could make several points of that, but that's a great story to talk about problem solving, or that's a great story to talk about thinking creatively, thinking outside of the box. There's probably 4 or 5 different ways that story can be used, but it's a great story. But you see how if we just take the simple data from that story, it's going to land flat. But we add tension in, we define that inciting incident, we talk about the stakes, we can really build that up and bring people's emotion in, and that makes our final point even that much stronger, okay? So you see how that works? So what happens then is we turn this into a story arc by adding those elements. Tension is the key. Now I want to add one more thing here to this training, and I want to talk a little bit about humor, adding humor to stories. So when we're telling stories, it's always great when your story has some humor to it. And here's the thing, just look for humor in the story. That's what you want to do. Look for humor in the story. And the story of this family in the Fiat, there's already humor in there. The fact that all 4 of them are crammed into this Fiat, you could talk a little bit about what that's like. Or the fact that the wife has to give up her pantyhose for her husband to put on the fan belt, right? So there's so much potential humor there. So you have to draw some of that out. But there's just a lot of humor already in the story. But here's the thing about humor. Humor works on surprise for most of it. And I want to introduce you to a really simple tool. I use it a lot when I'm speaking. It's called the rule of 3. So the rule of 3 works by saying 2 things that connect and then one that doesn't belong with the first 2. And by the way, I teach a speaking course, and I tell people who are taking my speaking course, listen, don't tell jokes. Don't tell jokes from the stage. Instead, use things like the rule of 3, because it's just so much easier to add humor into your presentation. But the rule of 3 works by saying 2 things that connect and then one that doesn't belong with the first 2. And it catches people off guard. So it would be like blue, red, Mickey Mouse. So even though that's not funny, that's just an idea of how the rule of 3 works. So let's say with the family in the Fiat, this would be an example. If I was telling the story, this would be an example of how I could inject humor using the rule of 3. I might say something like this. So we decided to pack all of us into the Fiat because, hey, it's never broken down on us before, it's great on gas, and, well, why would you want any leg room on a 10-hour car ride? So that's the rule of 3. So I'm saying these first 2 things that are making sense, then I say that last one. It kind of catches people off guard, and that's going to get people to laugh or at least chuckle or maybe even groan. But actually, I think that's pretty funny, right? So remember the family in the Fiat, the rule of 3, or you can just use the unexpected as another way for humor. So if I'm telling that story, I tell that whole story, it's a great story, and then at the end I can say, so what's the lesson from this story? Now people are thinking I'm going to talk about thinking outside the box, but I can say, so what's the lesson from this story? That every Fiat should come with a spare set of pantyhose. People are going to laugh. They can say, well, actually, on a serious note, though, what is the lesson here? And I might ask for people to make some comments. Okay? So anyways, I know that was a really quick training talking about how to tell a better story. But as leaders, we have to be excellent communicators, and you want to make sure that you're using the power of story when you are communicating to your staff. And listen, if you want more help and training with how to tell great stories, then you want to check out my Storytelling for Leaders course, and you can find more information on that below. But when you master this skill, not only will you become a better communicator, you'll also become the life of the party.